Thanks very much, Tom. Sorry my voice is a little tricky this morning. I've just flown in from Beijing, and prior to that I was in Riyadh, and so I'm not quite sure where I am today. But my voice was left several capitals away from here. So thank you for the kind and generous introduction, Tom. Why am I here? Well, I've been in politics, and I've done a few things like that, but in Australia we have this saying that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. So it's natural to actually come to Hollywood itself at some stage. So. And thank you, Michael, for the tour d'horizon of what's happening in the wider industry. That was useful and, for me, informative across the region. Can you hear me okay at the back there? Voice okay? I sounded a little bit like Mae West this morning. I always believed, though, in the Mae West doctrine of politics, which is it's far better to be looked over than overlooked. As Tom mentioned in his introduction, I've spent a lot of my life in and out of Asia, and a lot of my life in China. I began as a student of Chinese language at the Australian National University. Having graduated in the 80s, we were essentially unemployable in those days. Who was interested in China? And so the only place that would give me a job was the Australian Foreign Service. So off I went to Beijing and lived and worked there for quite a number of years during the 1980s, at various times in Beijing and Shanghai, Hong Kong, sometime in Taipei. So I got to know this region well, and subsequently, when I slid down the food chain of life into politics, and was our country's foreign minister and prime minister, I placed a huge priority on our wider engagement with the countries of the region: Indonesia, our neighbour, the other countries of Southeast Asia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, India, and the wider region. For our part of the world, this is home. And while Asia itself can sometimes be a very fractious family, as indicated just before, it's a dynamic family. And it's a part of the world which is remarkably confident about its future, despite the overlay of geopolitics everywhere. So in my time this morning, let me reflect for a moment on what I've been asked to talk to you about, which is this industry, the film and entertainment industry, occurs in a geopolitical context, whether you like it or not, like any other industry. Tomorrow, or the day after, I'm addressing the Semiconductor Association of America up in San Francisco. They feel geopolitics acutely, just like any other industry, and this one as well. It's very hard to separate yourself from the wider realities of what's unfolding, even though many of us would prefer it if we could do so. So looking to 2020, what's the shape of the wider Asia-Pacific region looking like? The central dynamic of it all is what's unfolding in U.S.-China relations. Who's here from China? Just give me a sense. 欢迎，大家都是北京来的吗？上海吗？什么地方？上海，大上海，上海我也住过，不错，那个小城市。The U.S.-China relationship is going to be increasingly difficult at a structural level, whether we like it or not. It's called geopolitical rivalry, and that's what's unfolding. If I look carefully at statements coming out of Secretary of State Pompeo here in the United States, this conflict, competition, call it what you will, between China and the United States, is assuming an increasingly ideological tone as well. Secretary Pompeo the other day described in his speech China as being hostile to American interests and values. So this ideational tone or content to the overall relationship, I think, is going to present us with greater and greater complexity, but frankly also some opportunities as the year unfolds. Geopolitically, as I said before, the US-China relationship has become increasingly fractious. quite apart from the obvious continuing flashpoints of unresolved tensions in the South China Sea, unresolved issues over Taiwan, and China's long-term determination to secure Taiwan's return to the PRC sovereignty, and unfolding protest movements in Hong Kong, there is a wider geopolitical competition now between China and the United States. I've lost the mic. Thank you for the sound department. I appreciate it very much. On the economy, there is a great debate unfolding in this country, and to some extent in China as well, called the Great Decoupling of the US and Chinese economies. Togo is the Chinese word. Like a lot of language in politics and geopolitics, language can be dangerous, particularly when it vastly exceeds the reality. I'm the first to recognize there are difficulties, profound difficulties in the US-China economic relationship. But to say that we are definitively on a trajectory towards economic decoupling is a vast exaggeration on the reality. Just reflect for a moment. The US-China trade war is serious. Yes, it's been raging for 18 months now. But because of profound economic self-interest on both sides of the Pacific, the bottom line is the likelihood that there will be a phase one trade deal between China and the United States, possibly by Thanksgiving, is, I think, highly probable. And that's because President Trump doesn't want to tank the US economy in an election year in 2020, and Xi Dada, President Xi Jinping of China, Uncle Xi, as some of us call him, he doesn't want to add further headwinds to economic growth within China itself. And the current trade war is having a palpable impact on business confidence in China, apart from other factors. It is in the deep interests of these two leaders to put this thing to bed as soon as possible. The phase one trade deal, I therefore think, is probable. Phase two, which is harder because it goes to some of the more intractable unresolved tensions in the US-China economic relationship, such as Chinese state subsidy for Chinese firms operating in the global marketplace. That is going to be more difficult, but on the balance of probabilities, given how difficult growth is for the global economy next year and for America and for China, a failure to deliver a phase two deal in the first part of next year would have a wounding effect on global confidence and business confidence in this country next year as well. So I think, while more difficult than phase one, it's still probable that we will get a phase two deal next year as well. The idea, therefore, that these two countries are proceeding in the direction of definitive, comprehensive economic decoupling as manifest in the $500 billion trading relationship between them is, to quote the Australian prophets, just a lot of bull dust. It's just not there in the data. Then you look at foreign direct investment, kind of more interesting and more complex, particularly in the tech sector. Foreign direct investment by China and the United States, largely driven by domestic deleveraging campaigns as they apply to Chinese firms, has been slowing generically to a trickle in the last year to 18 months. Less a reflection of the trade war, though that has influenced it, but primarily because of China's own restrictions imposed on the free operation of the capital account and your ability to repatriate dollars from within China to foreign partners. But so therefore, when I look at the foreign direct investment relationship, it is slowing, but for reasons probably separate from geopolitical tension at this stage. Interestingly, US foreign direct investment flows into China are largely holding up. Move to technology, it's a bigger decoupling question. Of course, we know what's happening with Huawei and 5G. And frankly, the fact that we've had a dual world of internet governance now for 15 or 20 years between China and the United States or between China and the West has now basically been accepted as part of the global geopolitical reality. We are likely to see the same now with 5G between the United States and some of its allies and China. And then an open question on where we go in the future of the semiconductor industry, computer chips, and more broadly AI, where China's own resolve to achieve national self-resilience and self-reliance in these new major high-tech drivers of the future, consistent with its 2025 National High-Tech Strategy and its National AI Strategy released in 2017, we are likely to see some significant decoupling in the tech sector over time. It will not be comprehensive, but some. That's the realistic prognosis. Then when I look at capital markets are actually saying something quite the reverse again. This is a huge financial relationship. If you aggregate all the numbers, including the equity holdings both in the New York and Shanghai exchanges, portfolio investment, plus the holding by the Chinese of US Treasuries, put all these things together, there is an aggregate financial relationship now of some $5.1 trillion. Not billion, trillion. This is quite a large piece of cash in anyone's measure. To put it in quantitative terms, that equals 1/3 of Chinese GDP. But this is not small, it's large. And there are huge mutual self-interests, both in Washington, New York, and Beijing and Shanghai, to keep these arteries of finance flowing. China has a particular interest as well. As of 2019, China, for the first time in a quarter of a century, is likely to generate its first current account deficit. It will begin to encounter the need for an international financing requirement. Therefore, China needs to keep global capital markets open to it because for the first time in a long time it has an external financing need. Not a huge one, but one which needs continued access to global markets. Now, there are political pressures pushing the other direction from Washington. I look at Marco Rubio's efforts to introduce what is called the Equitable Act, which would have the effect, if legislated and not vetoed by the White House, of forcing any non-compliant Chinese firm to delist from the New York Stock Exchange. I think there will be a view on the part of the New York Stock Exchange that may not be a good thing, but I think there's a long way for this one to play out, and the probability of the Rubio draft obtaining a majority in the House and the Senate remains very much an open question. And there are other proposals too to limit US pension fund investments into Chinese equities in particularly identified Chinese firms, which the United States government may have particular problems with for security or human rights reasons. Its prospects of finding its way through legislation, regulation, or through regulation is an open question. But my overall thesis to you when you look at what's happening in capital markets is that the evidence substantively of decoupling between the US and Chinese economies is fairly marginal. There are pressures, like the ones I've just referred to, but still marginal. I think one thing to look at in terms of future decoupling questions is the future of the renminbi, the yuan, and the dollar itself. China has long had a desire to internationalize the renminbi, its currency. It doesn't like being globally dependent on a dollar-denominated international economy. But there are constraints about what China can do, because China does not want to liberalize its own exchange rate on the yuan, nor does it want to open its own capital accounts to full, as it were, tradability. Why? Because China doesn't want to yield itself to external influence in its own domestic economic and political autonomy. Because of that domestic decision in China, there's therefore a limit to what China can do in traditional terms in freeing itself from a global economy which continues to be US dollar denominated. One interesting development, though, to keep your eye on is the announcement, literally within the last week, of China's proposal to accelerate the development of an international digital currency. an international digital renminbi, an international digital yuan. China is very mindful of what Facebook is seeking to do with Libra and wishes to be ahead of the curve. We therefore need to look very carefully about where this heads in the future as an alternative to China's classical and continuing traditional reliance on the dollar for its international economic transactions. And the reason I say that is that the global digital economy, currently dominated by Alibaba and by Tencent, is beginning to create a new demand for international digital finance of an order of magnitude which historically did not exist. This is a new dynamic in the new currency markets of the future. I conclude by saying this, that on the question of decoupling, the last thing for us to reflect on is what's happening with people, like all of you. I begin to see new visa restrictions emerging in both countries towards each other. This is not good. For the first time in the United States, the last 2 years, we've seen a decline in international student applications to American universities, driven by what's happening with China. I see an increase in Chinese student visa applications, by contrast, into the United Kingdom. And so what happens in this talent market long term, and the whole depth and breadth of people-to-people engagement and professional engagement right across the creative industries, technology and the rest, which has been accumulating for the last 40 years, I'm a little worried about where that is now headed. But my overall thesis to you is that whether it's trade, foreign direct investment, technology, capital markets, currency or talent, is that it's a mixed picture. But the overall fabric of continued significant economic engagement remains, albeit under significant and rising geopolitical pressure. A concluding thought or two about what all this means for your industry. It would be foolish for me to stand here in front of you today and say I know anything about your industry, because I don't. I just watch it, and I like it, and that's about all I know. So life is full of people, particularly in the political class, who stand up and pretend to know things that they don't. I'm not going to do that. You know what you're doing. It's your business. But here's just a final reflection and thought. On the structural tensions which exist between the US and Chinese governments and the economies, that will have some implications for the future in terms of domestic censorship regimes within China itself as it applies to foreign-produced product. It will have implications also in terms of potentially the number of foreign titles which are allowed into the Chinese market in a given year, currently capped at 34, and the proportion within that which come from the United States. And there may be implications too in terms of China's own, until recently, buoyant box office market and gaming market, despite the fact there have been some restrictions on gaming in recent times. But you as industry experts and professionals are aware of all of that. But my concluding thought is this. US-China relations, whether we like it or not, is affecting the rest of Asia big time. It affects Japan's perception of its future. It affects India's perceptions of its future. It affects Southeast Asia's perception of its future. And I've just been in the Gulf, and it affects the Gulf's perception of its future as well. If we end up being caught in an ultimate strategic and economic binary in a bipolar American and Chinese world. Now, therefore, those engaged in the business of geopolitics, professional diplomats like I have been in the past, basically so far have failed to deal with this emerging structural tension between these two elephants of the 21st century, China and the United States. By and large, the domestic political class in both countries have failed as well, as this crisis has simply gone from bad to worse. I don't see a whole lot of evidence of major corporate leadership in both countries trying to build bridges in the 21st century between the two economies because they perceive the domestic political pressures in their countries tearing them in a different direction. So all else has failed. We're surrendering the US-China relationship now to Hollywood. It's over to you to do some serious rethinking about how the hell do we manage this for the future. And I say this partly flippantly, but partly with a serious content. So much of international relations, in my own experience, having been a practitioner, as a professional diplomat, but also as a political leader, and now as a leader of an American think tank, focusing almost exclusively on US Asia relations, is this. So much of it hinges on the way we think about each other. The Chinese have a term, siwei, a way of thinking. And siweis in all of our cultures are deeply embedded. There is a deeply embedded Chinese worldview, a shijiaguan. There's a deeply embedded Chinese traditional siwei, way of thinking, about how you regard yangren, foreigners, how you regard bairen, white guys. Now, I understand that. Nothing wrong with that, just reality. Guess what? We foreign barbarians have exactly the same. So therefore, there is a remarkable opportunity for those of you who have a creative brain, and those of us in the political class, by and large, don't have one, to begin to explore different ways of thinking about each other through the enormously dynamic and creative medium of film and entertainment. There are stories and narratives, I'm sure, which may not lend itself to the current mood for general dystopia and may push us in a different direction. But my humble encouragement, someone speaking from the political benches, is dystopia doesn't get us very far. In fact, exploring underneath the deep thematics, both in love and in life, how people from utterly different and disparate cultures can not only coexist, but actually like each other, work together, and in fact form interesting creative futures together, that has so many possibilities. Not just in terms of good film and entertainment, in my judgment, but what would I know? I'm just from the political class. But also in changing the way we think about each other. And I think that is a serious challenge for the future. At the very end of the Qing dynasty, a small story. China's last imperial reformer, interestingly, the Empress Dowager, Cixi Taiho. Her closest friend was the wife of the then American ambassador in Beijing. And they formed a very deep friendship from about 1901 to about 1908. It's an extraordinary friendship when you look at the correspondence which arises from it. What an extraordinary basis for a film about how effectively the last empress and this brilliant international woman, part of the new face of Teddy Roosevelt's global diplomacy, could form a friendship in the midst of all of that. Now, if that was possible, why isn't it possible today? I thank you for your attention.